I'm Mark Baer. I'm your host every Tuesday and every third Tuesday of the Yorktown television program. This segment, my guest is Pushpa Iyer. She is a conflict studies expert. So let's talk a little bit about who you are and how you got here.
Okay. So, yes, I consider myself now a conflict studies professional. That's who I am now. But in my past life, before I came to the United States, I'm from the state of Gujarat in India. It's a western state, also known as Gandhi's homeland. You know, it's from where Gandhi led his freedom struggle. But it's very infamous for its tensions between the Hindu and the Muslim communities. I used to work for a Jesuit organization in this state, and we worked among the very poor people in the slums. Many of them were both, came from both communities, the Hindus and the Muslims, and the tensions between them meant that, we were constantly in the midst of one riot after another riot. So a lot of the work that we did through this organization, what we called holistic development, environment, community building, all of it was geared towards bringing these two communities together, building communal harmony, what we called. So much of my work experience in India was about, how could we bring these communities together? How can we make peace? What does it mean to have justice for the victims on either sides? But then I realized I didn't necessarily have an academic backing in this field. I went on to do other things academically, but not necessarily in this idea of peace and justice and resolving conflicts. So I looked for different programs related to that and found this wonderful program at George Mason University in Virginia, which has a program called Conflict Analysis and Resolution. So I came to do my PhD over there, and thought that as soon as I'm done, I'm going to go back to India and work again with these communities. But somewhere along the line, I became an academic, And for a long time, it was like, no, I'm a social activist. I'm not really an academic. I'm a fake academic standing in front of a class, and, trying to teach something over here. But now I think I've slipped more into the role. But if anything else, I have found the way to be a scholar practitioner. I am an academic, but I've always in my heart, I'm an activist, somebody who's advocating for justice and peace. So I'm trying to constantly bring those two things together.
So now you're at MIS. So let's go from there.
Yeah, so now I am here at the Monterey Institute for International Studies, and I teach conflict studies over there. I was teaching a lot on, my various courses are all tied in some ways to conflict studies. So whether I teach an introductory course in it, or I teach a class in women in war or culture and conflict, I'm always trying to look at different aspects of conflict and building peace. And we call it peace building in my field. So that's primarily what I do at the Monterey Institute. But I felt very much this need to do something more and beyond, especially bridging this theory and practice, because I am a practitioner still. And that's why I started the Center for Conflict Studies, which is a part of the Monterey Institute for International Studies. I founded it in 2011. And in 2012, August of 2012, it became a part of the Monterey Institute. So I now direct this center, and this is giving me the avenue to do a lot of the practice that I want to do in this field, as well as bringing the academic and the research part into it. So it's about bridging theory, practice, all together, and that's what the center is about. That's its mission, really.
Okay, let's talk about last weekend.
Yes. So last weekend, yes, was a very big weekend. I'm still recovering from it. We hosted our second annual conference, and this conference was titled Maneuvering the Maze, Understanding Justice in Conflicts. And primarily it was a conference to bring together, again, scholars and practitioners who work on the topic of justice and various forms of justice. So we did everything from environmental justice to racial issues, to looking at Native Americans and what justice was there, gay rights, gender issues. So bringing together these various notions of justice in various, say, sectors, and looking at how people understand justice, what does it really mean to different people, how do people approach it, what are the different techniques and methods that people use. We also looked at a lot at post-war societies, or transitional justice issues, as we call it. So it brought together a whole range of people. We had about 36 participants who were specifically presenting papers or, talking in different panels. And it was international in the sense we had people not just from the US, but from other parts, or at least had conducted research in other parts. So again, this idea of, the research work that they presented, or the practice that they presented, was something that they could bring the real world into their presentations.
And I know it's essential for you that this work that is not academic, that it does go back into the field.
Yes.
And so how have you watched had the experience of watching the work go back into the field, watching the application of the work?
Well, okay, that's a very interesting question, because the idea for me, as I said before, the mission behind the center, and primarily what I tend to do in my own life, is this idea is how can we take what we have on the ground, so getting the stories of the people on the ground, and I call it giving a voice to the voiceless. I mean, taking their stories, taking their experience, those lived experiences, and tying it up to all the things we learn academically, such as the theories, or even if you're doing research, not just sit and read 10 books, but actually go and talk to people and get that first-hand information. But once you have that information, the whole thing is about how well can you analyze it, how well can you really begin to understand the complexity or the depth beneath that data or that information that you have. And then once you have that, how do you then communicate it back to the world in a way that it's easy for people to understand, but it's also very real now because it's real stories that you're bringing in, or real experiences that you're bringing in. I could give you an example of a course that I organize almost every January, and it's called Challenges to Peace Building. But I take my students out to the field for 2 weeks, and we go to different post-war societies. So I've been to Cambodia with them, Sierra Leone, Nepal, I've been to Gujarat in India. And what we do for these 2 weeks is we are meeting different peace builders, people who are working for building peace, and whether it's, say, the government, whether it's the military, whether it's the NGO sector, whether it's international organizations, the UN, or just grassroots organizations, meeting them and asking them, what are some of their challenges? How do they go about their work of this building peace? How do they go about doing it? And what are some of the things they come across in the way, challenges and other questions that are raised for them, and how do they tackle them? And, learning from them basically firsthand. But one of the things I insist with my students when I come back is that when we get that information, we don't come back to the Monterey, and we don't come back to the Monterey Institute and say, hey, we went to Sierra Leone and that's it, it's over. I say we have to tell those stories. So it's again that same idea of that theory, practice, all of that, getting that information from the ground, but we have to give it back. So whether it's presentations at the Monterey Institute or for the broader Monterey community, whether we are publishing articles in a magazine or a journal, whether we are going to conferences speaking about it. We recently came out with a coffee table book from our trip to Gujarat, so we had pictures and we had writings on what we saw, what we observed, telling the stories of the people. So it's about getting that information, processing it, giving it back in some ways, so that it becomes more real for everyone around us as much as it is real for us. So I think that's my mission, that's my personal goal, and I try to incorporate that in every single activity that we do through the center.
Now, this must be very hard to remain an optimist because situations seem insoluble.
Yeah.
Are some situations insoluble, or are all situations soluble?
Yes, certainly.
Because they look,
yeah.
We have so many conflicts that just we don't see any way out. But
any
there
hope
has,
out there.
but the status quo is not tenable.
Right, that's true.
So how do you? What have you learned about that?
Yeah, there's a very a question that keeps coming up, and you're absolutely right. I mean, there are so many conflicts that seem very intractable. In the sense that, how do you find a solution to some of these problems? They seem so entrenched, in those values and beliefs that people are not easily willing to negotiate on, and that's why, they can be resolved so easily. A very interesting thing, maybe because of my experience working before in the field and then coming into conflict resolution and having a more structured way, let's say, of looking at the conflicts, looking at these problems and challenges and saying, how do we approach them? One of the primary things you learn is that for every 2 steps you take forward, you take 5 steps back. So there is that element of frustration, and there is that feeling of hopelessness in terms of what can we do, especially when we talk about what we call structural violence or structural conflicts, conflicts and violence that is embedded in the system, in the structure itself. How do you change an entire structure? And that could take, more than our lifetime. So that frustration of, I can't see the change, I can't see the results now, is there in all conflict resolution professionals. But the idea really behind it, as I explain to my students, and it's my motto as well, is that what is the alternative? The alternative is I'm going to sit back and just say there's nothing I can do about this, in my lifetime at least, so I'm just going to sit and I'm going to let it go. No, that's unacceptable. So if you are in this field, however much the frustration, you take those 2 steps forward, come back, go forward, come back, go forward, come back. And it's about really focusing on what we call incremental change, not necessarily the dramatic change, but if you could change things in a small way, because we always say peace is something incremental. You know, war happens, you know, in a big bang, but when you bring peace, it has to be slowly built upon something. And so approach it in the same way of saying, you know, we're going to do small steps and we go about doing it. It is very frustrating. And
so is what you do different than diplomacy, or is it part of the toolkit of diplomacy?
Well, diplomacy is one of our toolkits. I mean, we do more than that. I think the field emphasizes a lot on the analysis part of it, saying that unless you really analyze the conflict or unless you really understand it, you can't go and resolve anything. You know, you're not going to succeed. What are you going to solve if you don't really even understand the problem? And so in that sense, diplomacy is one of the tools, and so many other tools that we have, whether we do mediation or negotiation or, you know, what we call problem-solving workshops, you know. So we have a whole toolbox, but it's about matching the right tool once you know what the analysis is. But if your analysis is wrong, you're going to use the wrong tool to try and solve that problem. And so we emphasize much more on the analysis part than the actual resolution part, because we say we really don't know the answers. We don't know how to solve it. But if you do our analysis well, we know which tool to pick, and then maybe that would lead to a resolution. So that's kind of how we approach this thing.
Mm-hmm. So what's the biggest change in your mind when you started this field and as you've developed? What is...
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. What's changed for me, really? I mean, for me, the first thing is I came in as a human rights activist or a social activist. You know, a lot of it was about advocacy. It was about, you know, literally the black and white world. You know, something was wrong, something was right. It was about pointing fingers and saying, well, that's wrong, that needs to change. To coming to this field, I think, conflict resolution, which has given me a more holistic perspective, really, to say it's not just black and white. There's so much of the gray zone for, you know, what is right and wrong, and what is fair and unfair, and what is just and unjust. And so I think that, for me, has changed since becoming a professional in this field, as opposed to just being the activist. I still value the activism part of it, and I very easily can slip into that when I need to, but I think this holistic perspective that I'm getting of really being able to look at it and say there's no such thing as good guys, bad guys. It's more the idea of the gray, you know, of trying to get deeper into understanding what lies behind each person, and how do you understand values and beliefs and deep-rooted needs of people. I think it changes the way you begin to look at the world.
So it must require a great deal of creativity with this kind of problem
absolutely,
solving.
Yeah, yes, yeah.
I look at the one that fascinated me was the Hutu and Tutsi,
of course,
because they have to live together after there's this massacre, and I know that they had these theater troops that went in and afterwards and reacted and reenacted these things and made the perpetrators watch the crimes that they committed in this kind of theatrical. That was just really kind of mind-blowing. Yeah. And it had that. They were able to get through some of this stuff where I can't imagine they would have ever get through some of this stuff. Yeah. So it shows you, you know, from these isolated incidents that that resolutions are possible. Yeah.
Absolutely. And those are like long-term, right? I mean, healing of that trauma in the case of the Hutus and the Tutsis, and reconciliation, really bringing these communities back, you know, in some ways that they can actually coexist next to each other.
And I guess they did it with their own traditional tools, so you have to find what's appropriate. Within the tribal conflicts.
Yeah. And theater is a great way, you know, I mean, it's a great way of bringing together communities to talk about it. And one of the tools I'm getting very interested in myself and beginning to use that a lot is storytelling, you know, is actually getting people to tell their stories. And often, in certain certain cultures, it's not so easy to talk about your trauma. It's not so easy to, you know, say you want to go and have therapy. I mean, therapy is not even accepted in certain cultures. So how do people deal with these traumas, you know, and mass-scale traumas like which an entire community goes? And storytelling has proved very effective in getting people to tell their stories or tell the stories of others as a way of processing that same information. And storytelling is accepted in every culture. I mean, we all tell stories all the time. So that's become a very interesting tool as well. And I'm hoping to start this called a Peace Builders Fellowship this coming summer in 2014. And what it really is, the Peace Builder Fellow is a storyteller for peace. So they actually go out into the field and gather stories of people in war and violence or in conflicts, you know, even if they were not violent, but get those stories back and tell those stories as a way of drawing more attention to a particular conflict, you know, rather than say, you know, so many women are raped in the DRC. If you actually have the real stories of each one of those women, you give a face,
human face,
to the whole problem of rape.
So anyway, I want to thank you for being here today. How do people find you?
Well, they can go to our website, which is go.miss.edu/ccs, or email us at ccs@miss.edu.
And I just want to, before I say goodbye, I just want to say what an amazing place Miss is.
Yes, it is. It really is.
That we have in this small area.
And it's right here.
So anyway, thank you so much.
Thank you.
I'm Mark Baer. This is Your Town Television Program.